I'm going to pull up the agenda here. So welcome everyone. This is the meeting of the Housing Steering Committee. Today is June 23rd and it's 6 p.m. and we're meeting by Zoom. There's no in-person participants at this meeting. And can we have a roll call?
Committee Member Haroff?
Here.
Committee Member Kunstler?
Here.
Committee Member Paulson?
Here.
Committee Member Wagstaff?
Here.
The first item, or there's a quorum present. The first item on your agenda is approval of the minutes of the May 25th, 2022 meeting. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve those? Or have
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes. It's Kevin.
Second. Yeah, Gabe second.
Committee Member Haroff?
Yes.
Committee Member Kunstler?
Yeah.
Committee Member Paulson?
Yes.
Committee Member Wagstaff?
Yes.
And the main item on the agenda, item 3, is to review and discuss potential form-based zones for objective design and development standards, and to discuss potential housing element sites and the application of the objective standards, and to provide direction to staff, and our consultants are here too. So I'm going to turn this over to our consultants. I guess I'll start with you, David.
Yep.
Masonton. To make this presentation for us.
Great, thank you, Elise, and thank you to the committee to giving us an opportunity to meet again about this. I'm joined tonight by Andy Flower, who you know. He's leading the effort with the housing element, and also my colleague Ryan Call from Urban Field Studio, who I often work hand in hand with these sorts of efforts because he thinks about this stuff in a really smart way. So you remember last time we actually went through the different sections of the 360-page document, which I believe Elise provided you a hard copy on. Obviously, there's a lot of document there. What we wanted to do today is we wanted to look at one section, which is the first section, the substantive, which is the zones. So Ryan, are you able to share your screen?
Let me just get that going.
So the zones
that's
are
chapter 3.
That's
correct?
chapter 3. That's correct. So the zones are intended to provide basic information about a particular area, similar to how a city is zoned out by area, and it will provide some form-based code requirements for those areas. The odds does not handle density. The odds really is about form-based, shape-based code. So building height, setbacks, how it comes to the street, etc. Ryan and Elise and Andy and I all kind of kicked around a way to sort of get at this best, and I think we've arrived at a pretty reasonable place.
David, let me just ask really quick, are you able to see the presentation screen? Has it come up yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. This, give me 1 second.
There we go.
All right.
Yeah, why don't you go on to slide 3. So as you know, we're here to take the 360-page document that Optico's created for the County of Marin and try to customize it specifically for the city of Larkspur. So next slide, please. And so we're going to talk with the zones today. We'll talk towards the end of the show about the next steps and which sections we'll talk about next. But the zones is a pretty big topic because it really hits on some of the big issues I think the public is interested in, which is allowable heights throughout different areas of Larkspur. So next slide, please. So the zones, in the odds are divided into this group of 8, which really is just 4, the T3, 4, 4, and 5. And then there's different versions of each that provide slightly different allowables. Part of our effort over the last month has been to do this, which is to try to identify which zones are actually appropriate in the city. And next slide, please. And then just for the public's knowledge, each one of these zones comes with a separate set of control documents that talks about the way that the building is handled in terms of setbacks, height, somewhat to some extent the layout of how it fits on the site. And, I think this has one of the larger impacts sort of in the physical form. And that's why it's so important that we go through this. Next slide, please. So Ryan and I went through this, and, we started with the existing land use plan, which you can see on the left for the city of Larkspur. And then we kind of worked with that as a base understanding of how the city was divided up by zoning, so that we could think about the draft zones with some relationship to what's already there. So Ryan, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, and I think it's also just, it goes without saying that everything we got from Opticos is a starting point. And then we're going to be able to make changes with, if there's certain things that you're not comfortable with, or if there are economic realities that are particular to Larkspur, et cetera. So this is kind of an organizational strategy. We're going to choose kind of how many zones to organize these development standards. And then we can, in the next steps, as David will talk to later, we'll fine tune it. So we just kind of want to get in the ballpark tonight, and then we'll go through a much more refined process moving forward. But essentially,
real quickly, I forgot to mention, I think the way we're going to try to do this is we're going to talk about each area and then try to get your feedback, because I think it would be way too much information to try to go through everything and then come back. So I think, Elisa, does that work in this format? Do we have public comment at all in this?
We have members of the public that are here today, and I don't know if you might want to stop in between sections if you want, or just wait until the end and then take comment. I mean, you don't. We have a public comment section, but I think if it'd be nice to hear from the public if we could work that into the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd encourage stopping every once in a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, this is a working session. We've taken working with Elise, we've taken a stab at it. It's a first pass, and mostly we just need as much feedback as you can give us tonight. But like David said, our starting point was your existing land use plan. And so basically we figured out about how many zones we would need, and then organized our plan roughly based on where the land separations or land designations were drawn on the general plan. So basically we narrowed it down to 5 categories. And once we have these 5 categories, we can fine tune the naming. We can fine tune the standards within each of those categories. But we identified essentially kind of 5 different types of kind of commercial and residential residential production in your city. And so really quick overview is the T5 CMS is what we're calling Transit Village. And we've put this near the train and ferry stations. Now it's 5, predominantly 5, and then with density bonuses and affordable housing, you can push it up to 7. The T4 is that dark red Main Street small. That is the core historic downtown core that you currently have. And that correlates with the general plan, borders that were drawn. T4 CMS neighborhood center, predominantly 3, but it goes up to 4 with density bonuses. Where we put this is where there are existing commercial land uses that border residential neighborhoods. So kind of neighborhood serving commercial land use. And those are the projects that around the Bay Area are being targeted for adding a mixed use strategy to get residential counts out of retail sites and also underutilized office. T4SN, this is what we're calling core neighborhood. And essentially this is where it's predominantly 2-story, 3 stories with density bonus. And this could include townhomes, small scale apartments, things like that. And so we adopted the same boundaries that you had in your general plan, and looking at Larkspur, the product in those zones tends to be 2 to 3 stories already. T3 really represents, it's called edge neighborhood in the Opticos standards, but it's really your lower density, single family detached that are also according to the boundaries in your general plan.
This is Kevin. Can I just make a very preliminary comment on
Sure.
one aspect of it, T5, just the labeling of that as transit village.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a substantive comment. It's more of a perception. People in our community view that as Larkspur Landing. They don't view it as a transit village. I understand that that's a center for transit destinations because of the ferry and because of the smart train. But it's Larkspur Landing. That's what most people understand it to be.
Got it. Okay. Well, as I said before, tonight we're categorizing just broad, creating the broad framework, and then
right. That's fine.
Definitely, as we get into the next step, we're going to fine tune this. It will be
right. I just think that as a starter, that is not an appropriate label.
Got it. Okay. So we'll move on to Larkspur Landing.
Just a quick question, Ryan, if I can ask. This is Gabe here. It'd be really great to see an overlay with the existing land use, like just to see how it maps, what we already have in our zoning R1 and C and all that. Maybe you can just speak in general terms, like is there anything that's significantly changed?
No. So what you see on the left is your general plan land use. So what you see on the right is the zoning districts that we've identified for the development standards. And so essentially where we saw this color, which is predominantly single family homes, we applied the lowest density possible in the Optico standards, which is the edge neighborhood. So you'll see that the yellows, same color, they correspond, same boundaries. The downtown color is slightly different. This uses a crosshatch, but we adopted kind of just a dark red color. That corresponds, and so that's 2 to 3 stories, which is also consistent with that zoning. We have the orange, which in your general land use plan is predominantly apartments. And we've applied that to the same boundaries that were defined. And I took your existing map and I overlaid it onto our new map. And we worked with Elise to kind of make some, judgment calls as to, does this really belong in this category? And pretty much we kept things predominantly the same. So that was our strategy on this. This kind of crosshatch, these various crosshatch patterns, we were able to kind of group into simpler categories, and also implement a mixed use component. So some of the land use plan elements that you have do not describe a mixed use product where you have commercial plus residential. And so that's a big part of the housing element. And what we're trying to do in terms of the design standards is show you can have both commercial and residential uses on a site. And so those are the brown colors, which happen on your retail overlays. The last one would be the transit village, which we can change to Larkspur Landing, which is that golden color, and that's the highest density.
Great. And sorry, just one more preliminary question. So, whatever the zoning, if it's pure single family home or if it's pure commercial, then a lot of this doesn't apply, right? Like SB 35, SB 9.
Yeah, so SB 35 and 9, SB 35 really just is for multifamily housing. It does not include commercial properties. It's a great point. Single family housing, it doesn't apply for, but as you point out, because of SB 9, we need to address that. They just came out with a separate toolkit that Andy shared with us for SB 9 specifically. I think the intent under the Marin odds that were created was that T3 would be used to cover single family and would try to handle the SB 9 potential.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Okay, good. Should we dive into specific areas? Are we ready for that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So Larkspur Landing, obviously you have the ferry and the smart station. In this area, which is also somewhat physically detached from kind of the more historic core or, main part of Larkspur, has an opportunity to help meet your housing allocations. And then also it exists in largely a commercial context or a slightly more dense residential context already. So for this area, we've designated the predominantly 5, but with density bonuses, including affordable housing, you could push it up to 7. And the purpose for that is the threshold to get apartments into a city often requires a bit more density due to the high land costs and just the efficiency of taking a building down, or the inefficiency actually of recycling an existing commercial use and building a new residential building in its place. So to give kind of the maximum options for housing production, the T5 zoning allows a developer to pursue up to 7 stories in this area, but it has as of right with the 5 without the density bonus. So the area that's golden is really the area that's closest to the 2 stations. Where we are showing the up to 4-story with the density bonus is all of the kind of townhome area. Much of it's already built, but there is this site here where my cursor's scratching that is drawn right here, and that's up to 4 stories.
And that's the sanitary district property.
That's correct. Yeah. So
could I just I'm sorry, I ask one question. So can you just put your cursor over the ferry terminal parking lot?
Yeah, right here.
Yeah, right. So how is that going to be treated?
Well, right now it has a zoning overlay of the 5 to 7 story.
Okay.
And so the T5 CMS. So again, all this gold area is shown with that highest density. All of these properties having been already built out will have a significant cost element to replace what's already there. You don't have the benefit of a greenfield site with the exception of the sanitary district. So to make it feasible and so that something actually could happen, we're showing the highest possible density in those areas for up to 7-story.
Okay, and that's fine. I just wanted to clarify, and the reason I asked the question is that one of the discussions that's going on, since that is property that's Golden Gate Bridge District property, they're in the process of developing their own proposals for primarily development of structured parking. And it just kind of raises a more general question. I mean, I understand we're trying to just designate zones here tonight, but I'm just wondering to what extent those zone designations take into account what are in fact likely proposals for example, structured parking that would probably preclude not necessarily housing, but housing at the density and height that you would want, because they'll be on top of a parking structure.
The other thing I was wondering about that specific area is was geology taken into account? Because
absolutely.
Could these areas actually support the weight of a 5 to 7-story structure,
especially on top of a concrete parking structure?
Yeah,
I mean, this is all on Bayfill.
Yeah. So even the lower lying part of the sanitary district, I think that might be a consideration as well.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's like Ryan mentioned, there are some, constraints from a construction standpoint. You certainly could build what you wanted, but it starts becoming a cost issue, because if the Bayfill is not adequate, then you would have to come back and drive piles to achieve that. I guess the question would be, if they're going to provide structured parking, whether that is an attempt to free up land for other development, or if that's just to increase their overall capacity.
The latter.
Yeah. I mean, the garage itself would not fall, obviously, under the odds, and that would fall under the existing Larkspur zoning. requirements and review process.
Right, and that's fine, and that's kind of the way we're looking at it. But I just want to keep in mind that that's happening.
Yep.
It's likely to happen, and I don't want to create false expectations about what might be possible in an area where there will be potentially incompatible development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this keeps the door open, and BART stations all over the Bay Area, over time have transitioned from a strictly BART program into a mixed-use housing program. So, the designation of these zoning districts hopefully will stay in place for a while, and there could be future economics that support a model where some of the housing does take place on some of these transit sites. But there are not to say, I mean, your concern is completely valid, because there are major hurdles to redeveloping any existing site as something new, for sure.
Right. I guess the only reason I raise it is because there are plans in the work to use that property for structured parking to accommodate the ferry terminal. And I don't want to create false expectations about what could be accomplished. The plans that I've actually seen from the Bridge District are perfectly consistent with having housing on top of structured parking. I don't know if anybody is going to want to live there, but it's not theoretically not incompatible. But Dan's point is a very good one. I'd hate to see people think that something's going to be built there that's going to sink into the bay.
I live in El Cerrito, and we have horrible soils even on the hills. And it's a standard requirement that you have to have pile foundations, even for single family homes. So I suspect that, commercial seismic criteria, structural criteria, if something is built on that site that is housing, it's going to fall under all of the building codes in California. So,
and that's down the line. That's not what we're here to talk about tonight. Yeah. The reason for my question was simply to reassure myself that those prospects are taken into account in terms of how you're evaluating the zones and what's possible.
Yeah, definitely. So moving to the next one, this site is just again, it's on the other side of the freeway from your city core. And part of it is protected. The mobile home parks, we understand, are protected and are not to be rezoned. But the low-rise industrial area and the small shopping center here do have the potential to be a mixed-use solution that adds housing to your community. So we've acknowledging that these are very challenging sites because they have existing uses on them that are in operation. We are showing the golden color because has the most development options available to it, being the highest density.
That's fine.
Okay. These are some examples of the types of housing that could happen in that range, from 3 to 4-story townhomes to 5 to 6-story. This is probably a wrapped housing product where the garage is freestanding and they build the housing around the side. This is an example of a 7-story that has 2 at the bottom, and then 4, and then a 5th level stepped back. And some of the things that we'll be exploring with you in the next stages of this project is, if we have these densities, what's the best way to approach the building massing and other requirements that help inform how they're articulated? Because you can have a very out of scale building that's 7 stories or 5 stories, or you can have a building that's nicely scaled, that's delivers the same number of units. So those are things that we'll want to look at carefully. Any questions before I move on to the next set?
No, those are uncomfortable examples to look at from the perspective of someone living here.
Well, I will say that the one thing they do demonstrate is, you can do it a lot of different ways, and part of the next step that we'll take is how you actually handle the massing and the proportion, and the way that it looks can vary widely even for the same density. So.
And I appreciate that.
Could you clarify a little bit? We've been, talking about 3 to 7 stories, and there's a huge difference, however you mass them. So, in that cost plus plaza, again, we're talking about bay fill and, sea level rise and all that. But just from the perspective of this committee, could we say that the maximum height is 3 floors or 4 floors, or how does that work? I mean, I guess, we select a zone, but based on the existing land use plan and whatever you've looked at, could we actually, make it so it's has a limited height?
That's actually a good question, Gabe, because I worry about that as well. We're setting objective standards, but I'm very concerned, although I understand that we are being compelled to set objective standards, that those standards need to accommodate housing that will fit into the character of the community to which they apply. And that's why I just said I found that previous slide kind of horrifying, because none of those depictions would fit into the character of our community.
Well, I would say that, this is the opportunity to have that discussion, because the zones will lay out, building height expectations and allowances in each of these areas.
Right.
I think when we looked at this, since it was on the other side of the highway, it didn't, more density wasn't going to negatively impact other parts of Larkspur in the way of putting density in, near downtown or the existing downtown. So
right.
we saw it as like an opportunity site.
But keep in mind, the existing downtown is only part of Larkspur.
Yep.
And I don't live in that, for example, I don't live in that part of Larkspur. I live in Greenbrae. And I am more immediately affected by development that's closer to the 101 corridor than maybe people who live in closer proximity to the, the Magnolia Business District. So making sure that our design standards reflect the diversity of our Larkspur community is very important to me.
Yeah, can we go back to that?
Yeah, one addition. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can we go back to the previous slide just a sec? The one with the horrifying images. There we go. So what strikes me about this is that if you consider the acreage that these structures depicted would be on, that acreage would actually far exceed anything that's available to us in the zoning that you've proposed. So particularly the one bottom left. I mean, I could see that in an urban setting where you have an entire city block, but we're simply not going to have the luxury of having that kind of acreage to build a structure, anything that resembles anything like that.
Well, there is that in the Larkspur Landing. There's definitely that area. Yeah, so this
is not that would be consistent with that kind of a structure.
Yeah. Well, for instance, just to give you an idea of scale, this building here is probably from this corner here to here is about 300 feet. And then from here to there, or to here where it stops is another, that's probably 240 feet. So feasible in place of some of the parking lots and things that you do have in the Larkspur Landing zone, feasibly, you could see buildings roughly of that length and width happening physically. I'm just
physically, but physical opportunities are not. I don't think that the conversation we're having tonight. The conversation we're having tonight are objective design standards, right? And they, and what's feasible is going to have to be determined at a later time. So I think the concern that I'm expressing, and I'm kind of hearing from others, is that we may need to make sure that our objective design standards, which we will have to live with, are consistent and compatible with the areas where they're being proposed. And the depictions that you had in the previous slide don't seem to be compatible with any area within Larkspur.
Okay.
I have a second sort of a antecedent question. So this might be more for Andy, but of our 979 units, one of the takeaways from prior meetings was that we have enough space. So, if we were to restrict to 3 stories, would that in any way make achieving the 979 more difficult, especially in the view of HCD?
I don't think we can answer that question tonight.
Well,
can we? I mean, I think they've done some investigation.
Here are some trends that we've noticed. I'm doing the same exact exercise for the city of Palo Alto, and we're working side by side with economists on each site and each typology. And one of the challenges is if you do create a set of regulations that are not economically feasible, such as the density is too low in order to return for the developer to have an economic incentive to recycle the site from a commercial use to a residential use, then they do acknowledge that, okay, the zoning won't allow something to happen feasibly, so we need to consider a different solution. And so part of what we're doing tonight is we're having a discussion about what's appropriate for Larkspur. But that's also side by side with how do we achieve the unit counts, and then also what is economically feasible in these areas. Right,
but that I don't think that really answers Gabe's question. I think Gabe's question was whether we're being required to accept design standards that envision the kind of density that is depicted in that previous slide, or whether we can accommodate our obligations under state law without those kinds of structures.
So the housing element, it identifies specific sites of which make up those 900 odd units. So one of those sites is the cost plus site. Andy, do you happen to know what the assumption was for that site in terms of dwelling units per acre? Do you happen to remember?
I don't have that right on the top of my head, but I can say that we've brought in our experts here today because we know that one of the things that HCD is looking at closely is the reasonable predictability that what we put on paper will actually end up with something on the ground.
And that's fine. And we're not trying to undermine that effort at all.
Sure.
I think the question is really, because we don't have a choice. We can't undermine it. We'll get sued. So the question really is whether our design standards are allowing more than we need in order to meet our statutory obligations, and more than what would be consistent with the expectations of our community.
Okay, this is what I believe we're headed towards, is to have a deeper discussion about trade-offs. So tonight we're going to learn about the options and the opportunities for each of our areas. And then in our next meeting, my guess is that our topic will be what will be the trade-offs if maybe the steering committee is uncomfortable with the concept of a 7-story limit. What kind of pressure does that put on other sites, particularly if we're not in a position to?
Well, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Great. I mean, it may create pressure on us to do different things. But the problem, that's not a problem. The concern that I have is that by adopting objective design standards, we will kind of be constrained by them in terms of individual decisions about individual properties. And I am leery of having that constraint.
Can I want to bring back a point that I just really value that Ryan and David have brought to the table here. And that's the assumption that is integrated with these objective development design standards that have to do with anticipating the possibility for density bonus. And so rather than having that come to the city in a way that is surprising and that we're not prepared for, and that there's no regulations at all therefore, we have to keep in mind that the zoning for these areas may allow a certain height, and we're anticipating the worst case scenario. I'll use that terminology because maybe in what I'm hearing tonight that these images for these very tall buildings are something that feel anathema to what you understand as Larkspur. But there are state laws now that allow for, particularly within transit areas, that you can go 3 stories above what the underlying zoning allows, with only objective development standards in place. And that's with certain criteria, and we can bring the specifics for that law to our next meeting if you'd like. But so for these areas that are transit oriented, these are the areas that we know that the state wants to see a real effort made towards enabling a diversity of housing typologies and the kinds of regulations that enable real feasibility to happen so that something can actually get constructed. The idea here is that the higher buildings would be tucked into the hills in ways that wouldn't be, well, it's already true. I was shocked when I drove through the neighborhood. I didn't know that there was this kind of density in Larkspur. And
no, we've already done that. So we're used to doing it, and it's not something that we, I mean, obviously, since we've already allowed it over in that area, that's not something that we are inherently opposed to. Again, my concern really is to make sure that the objective design standards are created in a way that reflects the character of the zones that exist and do not create opportunities for development interests to come in and say, well, the design standards say, you know, this is all okay. They're objective and we can do whatever we want. That's my worry. I understand we have opportunities for development over in the Larkspur Landing area. That's been true forever. That said, that's not what we're doing right now. What we're doing is we're creating objective design standards for different zones that are not necessarily the same as what you find over on the cliffside by the old quarry in Larkspur Landing. It's just different. So I just would think we need to be mindful of that and make sure we respect, because we're elected people, that we respect what we think are the views and perspectives of our community, and not create opportunities for developers to come in and say, well, we can build whatever we want to because it's going to comply with these objective design standards that you people approved.
Let's flip the script on that a little bit and recognize that right now state law enables developers to build a lot of things that that don't require discretion at all. The only rules we can use are objective development.
I understand that.
So we're protecting the city by recognizing the full density bonus capacity that might be possible with development. So we're creating a safety net. That's part of what we're doing here.
I understand that, and I appreciate that, and I understand that that's a challenging thing to do. That said, you know, setting aside my own personal views about the density bonus laws, we need to make sure that we are not creating opportunities for development to take advantage of density bonus laws to create structures that are incompatible with the character of our community.
Well, that sounds like we have shared goals, because that's exactly why Ryan and David are here with us tonight. And it's probably a little shocking. We're starting with the most dense area, and so it's going to get easier from here. And all of your feedback is going to help us cater and tailor these objective standards to what you're helping us understand that Larkspur would want.
So we do have shared goals, and I appreciate that recognition.
And we also, I mean, this is the first step of a few as we go through this. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities in defining how the odds shape the buildings. You know, I mean, this is sort of like the first pass, but then we're going to be talking more about setbacks and massing and proportion and those things, which will have, I think, a more significant impact on how the buildings are read in terms of their relational character to Larkspur.
Okay, well, thank you.
Good. All right. Well, that was all very helpful. And let's go on to the next one. Is that all right? So we've got housing in the middle, essentially. And so when we looked at this area of Larkspur, there's a lot of, there's a lot of slope in the terrain, and the homes there tend to range from 2 at the top of the downslope down to 3, or in some cases 3 with some parking underneath it. But this area was largely attached housing, whether it's flats or townhomes or the senior housing. This was an area that is denser than other parts of Larkspur. And so the core neighborhood zoning really up to with the density bonus seemed one that was very well aligned with what we're already seeing in this district. So are there any thoughts on that, the orange, and then we'll jump into the brown color?
No, that's basically the part of Greenbrae that's around the Tamalpais, right? That's what I'm looking at. That's the bridge up in the upper left.
That's right. Yeah. And so, I mean, we noticed all those waterfront buildings that you see in that photo all tend to be 3-floor or 3 over parking. So I think they're pretty congruent with what this is set up to do.
Correct. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's true.
And then the next part of it is the T4 CMS, where we have at the intersection of these arterials, there of course is more people, and more people means there's a little more activity. So those areas which are currently commercial, we have zoned as 3-story with the option to go up to 4 stories with the density bonus. And again, at the 3-story height, there's really the most common product, the most financially feasible product in that range tends to be a for sale townhome that has parking on the first level and 2 to 3 stories above that. Mm-hmm. The other 3-story apartment type that you sometimes see is called a garden apartment, where the cars are parked in a parking lot next to a freestanding building on grade. And most of these sites are so small, it'd be very difficult to pull off any meaningful density with that. Correct. So really, when we show the up to 4-story density, likely what you would see is a townhome with a parking on the first level and maybe kind of an office or small bedroom, 2 full levels above that, and then a small penthouse roof deck is the common. It maxes out the code allowance for having height with a townhome in that situation. So that we're showing in the brown districts where there might be some commercial uses that go along with those residential.
And there are commercial uses already there, which is fine. That's where the hospital is.
That's right. Yeah, right here.
In the medical offices on South Elysia.
Yep. And so these are some examples of various 3- and 4-story buildings that are recently built. Walnut Creek, this is up in Queen Anne, up in Seattle. I wasn't trying so much to show a style. It's really just to kind of give you an idea of the height and how some buildings are approached from a massing perspective. These are clearly from different places, and and are not literally Larkspur. So, but they give you an idea of, this building here is 3 stories. Its parking's off the back. It's 2 at the front. That's like a pretty good example of what you might encounter into the orange color. This building here is predominantly 3, and it has a small section that's 4. That is a possibility for something that would have the density bonus to it. Should I keep going, or any questions?
Please.
Okay.
Please.
So the downtown, the kind of the most congruent zoning with that was the T4 SMS Main Street small, which is predominantly 2, but with density bonuses up to 3-story. And a lot of the sites in the downtown are quite small, with the exception of the shopping center here on the corner. And so that has the same exact zoning, though, as the rest of the downtown core. And the concept was, let's keep that as consistent as possible. It's not currently perceived really as a historic part of the Main Street, but if it was redeveloped, it would be nice to have a continuity with the Main Street because it is directly adjacent. So that was the logic behind carrying that zoning into that space.
That sounds good.
And these are just examples. styles of architecture are going to change over time. What's popular now won't be popular in 10 years and won't be popular in 20 years. And so with all different downtowns or cities, you'll see a variety of styles varying on how consumers' tastes change and location. So I tried to grab a variety of, from traditional to modern examples to demonstrate what the size and scale of 2 and 3 stories might be.
A quick question there, specific to our, Magnolia, like Ward Street and, King Street area, that's, got a lot of our character, the historical downtown. I didn't really see anything in the Optico, that would address that. Can you say a little bit about how, a selection of zoning or anything down the road might help us preserve some of that character?
If I can start, Ryan.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
I do want to point out that it's been advised through our team that that we keep the downtown area for the most part outside of the opportunity sites map that we'll be using with our housing element, and that's for several reasons. One of them that the sites are very narrow. We don't want to encourage consolidation of lots. In that we don't want to lose that character, that downtown character that exists. Instead, and for other reasons too, we would love to enliven the downtown by encouraging redevelopment of, say, where the grocery store here is in the foreground of this image that we're looking at. We understand, for one thing, there's property owner interest in doing that. We would love to make sure that what we leave you with, that it's something that it's feasible for that property owner to actually turn that over. And if that site were to suddenly be filled with residential, with a structure that's in keeping with the design and development standards that we hand over to you here at the end, then that will only enliven those downtown businesses and help the area continue to thrive and be honoring of the historic downtown nature that you have there.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Andy. And I think that goes back to our earlier comments about trade-offs. I mean, I think, what Kevin was saying and what I was asking is, if we could take the 9 areas and kind of rank them on a list, some are going to be ones where there are going to be stronger objections. But I think the overall economic constraints, and in this case, the regulatory constraints of, getting enough units and, good faith to HCD, I think that's really where, for me, the question was also just, asking you to keep that in mind and keep us posted on your reasoning there.
It's an interesting conversation that we'll have further down the line, but it's somewhat related to that. And when it comes to apartments versus for sale, an average sized apartment in the Bay Area, and this is a broad generalization, but a 2-bedroom apartment at 850 to 1,000 square feet is pretty standard. And so when you look at how many of those units that a site can support, it's usually double the density of how that site would lay out with for sale townhomes. So when you look at all of the different districts in total for Larkspur, if you designate some districts where it's where you can actually achieve the financial feasibility to build an apartment or a flat, then that helps soak up a lot of your housing demand and it relieves pressure on other parts of the city. And so that's the balance that we're going to be using throughout this process to gauge where we spend the density.
And that's I think exactly. And that's a conversation that we have yet to have. I don't think that's a conversation for tonight. I think it's more what we're looking at is what are the appropriate objective design standards that we are comfortable supporting for the different zones that you've identified. And obviously this has a unique characteristic and requires distinctive design standards. Same thing is true with others. This is clearly an opportunity site, but in terms of its future development, there's lots of things that are going to have to be taken into consideration, like there's an existing grocery store there. If that's taken away, then where do people buy groceries? So those are things that's not for tonight, but those are parts of the discussion that we're going to have.
Yeah, and I think at the 2 to 3 story density, which is the T4 SMS, the horizontal mixed use, not a vertical mixed use, is really your only option in a scenario like that. So what we're seeing throughout the Bay Area is to get a vertical mixed use to pencil, you're looking at a structure that maximizes the efficiency of 4 or 5 stories of wood frame over the retail. And if you don't maximize the cost efficiency of that, it's really hard to get the return. So that would not be appropriate for the downtown. But as we look at the whole, the larger area, there is the advantage that those types of products pick up a faster density count. So anyhow, let me go to here.
You want to go back to slide 9, which is just the overview of all the different, the whole zone map, because I just want to touch in with, the committee here to see if you had any other comments. I think, the one place where there seemed to be a high level of discomfort was really that cost plus area. Is that something that you want us to revisit in terms of the density allowable? I do think what Ryan said was right, in that it's a costly area to develop in, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I don't know exactly what density would be required to make it pencil, but it's going to be a pretty significant undertaking. But
and again, that's fine. If the focus tonight is on design standards, then I don't know that we have to get to that point. I think Gabe actually raised a good point that will be more relevant in our future discussions, which is the suitability of some of these properties for the kind of development that would accommodate high density. The cost plus property is basically about 3 inches above the bay.
Yeah.
And it will be subject to flooding. It won't be, in all likelihood, 25 years from now, it will not be a viable property because of flooding. And that's another concern that I have as we go through this process, because, one of the other issues that is of great concern to me is the steps that we will need to take to address, and in this case, it's bay level rise as opposed to sea level rise. And by accommodating structures that may meet the current expectations in terms of housing, may just not be viable when sea level rises 3 feet.
Well, I think whether you're using a townhome or an apartment building, or whether it's 2 stories, 3 stories, 1 story, all of those things, you have to take into account sea level rise.
You bet.
And so in Palo Alto, one of our districts is 1 story tilt-up office, and they're eyeing that area for higher density, and in that particular case, 4 stories. And we have to raise the grade by like 10 feet. So, yeah. It's one of those things where is the cost of that raising the dirt going to kill any project feasibility? And it might for a while. Like that could be a very, very difficult financial hurdle to overcome.
Well, there's not only the sort of the physical, the cost of doing it physically, but all of these structures are going to require flood insurance, which in a floodplain is extremely costly.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the flood insurance rates have gone up, very, very sharply just in the last year.
And increasingly have become unavailable in certain parts of the country.
And when you're in a floodplain, my daughter lives in New Haven, Connecticut, so familiar with that area. You just cannot get flood insurance when you're close to the water.
Right.
And if you can, it's $6,000, $8,000, $10,000 a year for a single family home. So you're looking at economic feasibility in addition to the actual physical feasibility.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Elise.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ryan, can you speak to that 10-foot requirement? Is that an international building code requirement?
No, it's just looking at the situation where this particular property is. Sea level rise is important, and they already have issues with flooding as it is today. And so to remedy that, and they recently did develop a set of a few acres of townhomes there on a former commercial property. And all of those units, basically you berm up, you have to bring in fill, you raise the whole site, and you berm up at the street. And then it's level. Once you're in the price, essentially up on a mound because they're anticipating more intensive flooding issues. It's not like it's waterfront property, but it will need that height. And Hawaii has been doing this for the last 20 some years. So that site where the cost plus is extremely challenging. It's very flat, it's very low. The other areas where we have the hillside to work with that are also gold, I want to go back to David's question, is there comfort in keeping the T5, this is basically an apartment typology. Is it worth keeping a T5 designation on the map for this for the Larkspur housing element?
And you're suggesting that maybe you would reduce this, you would change the standard so it wouldn't quite be as tall. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I want to kind of get the comfort level because right now the gold does suggest up, 5 with this density bonus up to 7 stories. And what that permits is rental housing, essentially, which is can be very challenging to achieve at the lower densities. Right. This area has hillsides to build on. They're less sea level. They're not non-existent, but they're less impactful than the cost plus site. Is there a different opinion about what's appropriate for this area than what's appropriate for the whole, I keep calling it Whole Foods, but the cost plus site?
I guess that raises a good point in terms of the way this area is laid out. Setting aside what, for example, the Bridge District wants to do with their parking lot, as you pointed out, there has been development at significant heights up against the hillside over in the Larkspur Landing area, and if there are opportunities for doing that, that would be great. It may be worthwhile kind of separating out within this area where the opportunities exist to be building up against hillsides as opposed to building in areas that are essentially flat and hardly above sea level currently. And I'm not sure this designation really reflects that.
Well, I think we have the ability. This is all the process we're doing. So we could say that there's 2 different T5 districts. That's
kind of what I'm leading going towards.
Right. That's certainly within the realm of what we can do.
Yeah. One thing I guess the question was, should we revisit, how we zone cost plus? And this kind of goes to, the scope of tonight. So I think, the scope of tonight is, investigating or just starting to discuss the trade-offs. And, we're not, setting anything. And, there's economic constraints, there's physical constraints, there's, aesthetic and community constraints. I would say one thing that, maybe Brock and Dan, you can chime in as well, is one of my concerns is that we integrate with, the other elements like the circulation element and the safety element and so forth. So, to your question about cost plus, I think all of this happens without any CEQA. And, there's might be quite a lot of, mitigation and environmental impacts in that area, which, as a city, we could say, look, let's just go somewhere else because, that damage we can't control. And then, for the safety element, it's not just the cost of the developer, it's also the cost to the city. We have, flood control projects, we have to take care of more citizens in a more vulnerable area, which is extremely evident in the, wildland urban interface, but, along the sea, the same. So I think, we're not just pushing this back for aesthetics. The massing was the comment, but for me is how well does it integrate with the rest of the plan? the safety element, the circulation element, and all that. And I really hope that as a team, you guys are looking at the document as a whole. I mean, I know that you're mapping it to what was, but I think that times have changed, especially the environment. And, so I think that to me is, where I see today's discussion too is, we have these 9 areas, we have these, 5 to 10 different zones, and we're not pinning any tail on the donkey yet. But I'd like to make sure that it's done wisely with regard to all the other elements of our general plan.
I actually, just chipping in a little bit, I realize that there's going to be changes in the flood elevation, but I think there's a whole bunch of ways you can deal with that, just speaking as an architect, and people have and are. And I wouldn't necessarily take away the denser zoning, speculating that nobody could build there because of flooding. I think people will find a way to build there if it makes economic sense.
Right, but if we can impose conditions upon developers to build seawalls, that would be fine. I don't think that's something that is envisioned here.
Well, the building code does require, and there's, whenever you're on the coastline, there's massive scrutiny of projects. So it's really challenging building anywhere, near the water.
Yeah, right, but that's very close. That's close to the water. I mean, the cost plus is probably not within the jurisdiction of what the agency is.
I would think it
definitely is.
Yeah, BCDC.
Okay. Yeah, BCDC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I agree.
Yeah,
so
that's fine, because BCDC is notorious for not allowing that kind of development.
Yeah, and I honestly, I don't know, Andy, if you can answer this question, but I mean, I'm not sure what control BCDC will have, as it relates to SB 35.
That's really an excellent question, and I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if you guys can provide an answer to that. It would be helpful if you could.
We can do,
because we're talking about our general plan and what we can do within our existing zoning districts, but especially with projects that are within BCDC jurisdiction, it would make not a lot of sense for us to be identifying things that BCDC is unlikely to ever approve.
That's a great point. Yeah, we'll have to do a little research. I'm not sure if that is something that another community has really kicked the tires on.
Does that comment also apply to South Alicio?
Probably not. I don't know that that's in BCDC jurisdiction. You got to be close to the bay, and I don't know that that's close enough to the bay.
Elise, do you have knowledge of that?
I know that there's a property right now with a gangplank that's under BCDC jurisdiction, I believe, and that's on the South Alicio, not quite. So it's still in the residential area. I'm not sure how far their jurisdiction extends towards the bridge. The other thing that we might.
There's Dan.
Oop, there's Dan, but he's fading. He's got a bad internet connection.
Sorry, Dan, we can't hear you. But I would say too that the sites that you're finding to be more challenging are also ones that would require rezoning because they don't currently allow residential, and so they may.
The bridge is, yes, sorry, but the bridge is in the.
We're not hearing you, Dan.
And Elise, I think to carry on with your point, you're saying it would require rezoning, which would also require CEQA environmental review.
Right. So the sites that we're finding more challenging would require rezoning to allow residential in terms of the administrative zone and also the area at cost plus. And so that is a more complicated process for us getting our housing element approved in time as well, and would require an environmental review that's not being covered in our general plan environmental review update. So it's just something to keep in mind as we're looking at other sites too. There's some that may not require rezoning like that. And there might be just easier sites to have in our inventory that don't involve quite as much work to to allow for housing.
I
wanted to ask you too to comment on North Magnolia. That wasn't specifically on a slide, but that's another area where 4 stories is being proposed. And then the Bon Air Shopping Center. They're both Bon Air and the North Magnolia area are provided the T4 CMS up to 4 stories. And so I would like to hear people's comments on that.
In terms of what issue? Or
if it's something that anyone has an objection to, or if it's something that could proceed when we bring this map or the zoning back again.
No, I mean, I think it's perfectly appropriate. I mean, the shopping center has been under consideration for forever, as long as I've been dealing with these issues. Same thing with North Magnolia. And North Magnolia is, you know, it's in some ways it's kind of like Larkspur Landing, because a lot of it's built up against a hillside. So that could accommodate greater height for that reason on certain properties, not on all properties over there, but on some. Bon Air a little bit different because it's already on a pretty flat piece of property. Not sure that was responsive to your question.
Oh no, I just wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to comment on that one too.
So
for those two.
Elisa, in North Magnolia, are they actually proposing 4 stories there?
Yes.
Yes.
The 4th story is a partial story. Is that right, Elise?
Right. The 4th story is just a partial story.
It says back, but it is in that condition that you mentioned, which it's, you know, the hill is right behind it.
Right.
And that's where the Corbett's is?
The old Corbett's property.
Yeah.
Right.
Or was.
Out of curiosity, about how many extra units would come from that setback 4th story?
None. They're not, it's not creating additional units. It's just giving them more floor area.
It allows them a roof deck, which provides them the ability to meet the price points to make it pencil out, is our understanding.
Is it still 22 units?
It's 20, and I think our housing element has over 60 for that site.
That would be
the existing housing element.
I had a general question. I was wondering, I know we're only talking about chapter 3, but it seemed like in chapter 11, you know, say we said it was only 3 stories, but there's a possibility to allow 4 stories. Isn't that true? Like the objective design standards are, you know, what's minimum and sufficient, but you know, we could also go beyond that, like in the spirit of variance, or did I read that wrong?
Yeah, there are, what they've allowed in chapter 11 is kind of ways to work around unusual situations generally. I think it's less than a carve out as if you have something unusual with your site, and then like, how do you deal with that? I don't think it necessarily provides you a carve out to, you know, do spot zoning.
I see. Well, I've actually met with the North Magnolia residents. You know, 2 of us did a walkthrough, 3 together, and then about 20 people chimed in, and I think they went to the site. I mean, I think that one might face some opposition, and in the spirit of trade-offs, you know, I mean, 22 units is not, you know, we're not talking about, you know, the 100 by 100 yard, you know, 300 foot, you know, type of design you were showing earlier, but you know, I think that you know, that's a little bit more like the downtown area. I'd be a little more cautious about, you know, preserving character and minding the neighbors versus Larkspur Landing. I mean, that does seem to be the prime target for up to 7 stories if it's hillside and so forth. So, I mean, that's kind of a general comments. I don't know if I can be more specific, but I've tried to go through the 9 areas and rank them for aggressiveness of height. And, you know, that one was towards the lower end, and the downtown even lower. And, you know, so that's sort of the feedback I've gotten.
That's great, because I think ultimately it's going to come down to where we have impacts, you know, as far as where we spend our density. And if we kind of go with an even spread of butter across the whole thing, then you got to cover more of the bread. And versus if we can target it in areas where there's maybe less impact because of the Larkspur Landing is detached kind of from the bulk of the city, then it takes the pressure off these other sites to yield higher numbers in the overall look at it. So
great. And the other thought is, I don't know how clear I was earlier, but when it comes to the safety elements, of our plan and the circulation, I mean, the traffic, like if you're to go across the bridge or up to the College of Marin or down Sir Francis Drake, every additional, unit or car, does add to congestion. I think, the concept of having something at a transit hub is really pretty good for the city. And so, and then of course, I don't know if that's WUI area or what, but I do think that that area, may be, a greater risk and, more for the fire department, so forth, as far as the city goes. So, again, just trying to look at trade-offs, all around. That's, another reason I sort of deprecated or pushed down North Magnolia for height and actually just for a number of units.
So did we want to take public comment at this point, Elise, or?
Sure. And if anyone that's in the audience wants to make any comments, feel free to raise your hand and we'll let you speak. Okay, we've got 2 hands raised. I'm going to start with Dawn Matheson. I'm going to let you speak. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. What were you saying?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So I wrote down a few things while you guys were talking. One is that that diversity is kind of important, at least the way I see it, so that if you are talking about people having trouble with building heights, that if you've got a nice differential to your building heights, in other words, like if you're starting out at sea level and going higher, like a building that's on a hill looks a lot bigger than a building that's on the ground. Buildings of the same size, the one that's on the ground is going to look smaller than the one that's up on the hill. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about height. The next thing was, I was wondering if you guys are taking into account zoning requirements for accessible townhomes when you're talking about making housing stock, because that's something that, because Larkspur is such an old city that, everything's grandfathered in, and none of that was taken into account when most of the homes were built here. And when a person that has special needs goes to buy a home, that may be something that you could use as a carrot for developers. I don't know, that's just something that I thought would be worth thinking about when you're talking about plans for the future. And would make Larkspur a little bit more progressive. And then another thing that really concerns me personally is that I would hate to see us lose any of our commercial spaces. Because what happens over time is that the equilibrium of the value of the property as commercial versus residential kind of changes. And once it becomes more profitable to make that a residential property than a commercial property, it's almost impossible to invert it back to a commercial property. And I hate, a lot of work went into preserving the downtown when the malls were built. And I really, really want to make sure that we preserve commercial properties in Larkspur. And then the final comment I have is that North Magnolia needs units because of the school. There's not a lot of housing for the students. And I know that it's mostly a commuter university, but it's not completely a commuter university. And we had a professor who was driving over from Davis, commuting from Davis because he couldn't find a place to live. So there is a need there in that area. And I know that, the people probably don't want the students, but I think that school is a really special resource and that we should take that into consideration. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next, I'm going to call on Riley Hurd to speak. Oops, I'm sorry. I think I just took off your permission to speak. Now you should be able to unmute.
Thank you. And good evening. Let me lower my hand here. This is a really important process. My name is Riley Hurd. I'm a local land use attorney. I also represent a number of property owners in Larkspur, including the sanitary district site and the Cost Plus site. Also, I am working with the Opticos design standards document daily in San Rafael. And that is because they've already adopted this. I have about 1,000 units in the hopper using this plan. I have a lot of feedback. I won't give it all tonight, but let me strongly encourage you, first of all, with a form-based code like this, to build in an exception procedure. If you don't do that, the applicants end up simply using the waivers and concessions available under state density bonus instead of the objective standard form-based code. And that's what's been happening in San Rafael, because there are certain things, every site is unique, that you just can't comply with. And so we end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So that's my first point. My next point is the sanitary district site. To yield the density that site's going to need to have, and it's really one of the central sites, I think, to the housing element, it's got to be a T5 CMS zone. And we heard kind of the barriers to development of the already built sites, because you got to look at the land cost and tearing down structures. This is really the only greenfield site in the city. And to make the density work and to make a project pencil, 3.5 stories is not going to cut it there. So I would strongly encourage you to make that site more akin to the T5 CMS or whatever you end up with at the top end of the spectrum. It's just a critical site. I wanted to make a final point about the Cost Plus area. And I think it's really important that this committee is aware that there is a multi-jurisdictional effort with millions of dollars of funding to address sea level rise in this part of the county, exactly right here. And that includes the county, Corte Madera, the Transportation Authority of Marin, who owns the pathway, SMART, who's got the raised rail bed. They are looking at all types of sea level protections for this area. And I've also just completed applying for a project in one of the FEMA flood zones. And it was mentioned earlier that there is a required construction methodology of flow through first floors and all types of things that make this a possibility. So I just would encourage the group not to just write it off because it's in a low-lying zone. Things are happening. So thanks a lot for the amount of time that you're putting into this. And I hope you will consider those comments. And offline, I would be happy to talk with anyone about my experience using the Opticos document in another jurisdiction. We've learned a lot. Thank you.
No, I think, Elise, we should definitely consider getting the boots on the ground feedback, as much as the more we can learn about what's actually been happening with that document, the more we can head off and do a better job for Larkspur. So thank you. Thanks, Riley. Yeah. Any other comments from the public, please?
There's no one else with a hand raised. Okay.
David, do you want to jump back to next steps?
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly, I'll say that next time we want to talk about site design and building types, which are two sections, for sort of the next two main sections. The specific uses section is really about what uses are allowed in zones. So I think that is less of an issue, but I think the site design and building typology, which starts getting into scale, proportion, setback. I think that's going to be of significant interest to all of you. Ryan, go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
And we'll cover all of these, types of issues that you see here that are graphically depicted. So we certainly look forward to that discussion. We certainly appreciate everyone's feedback tonight. It was very, very helpful. I think we heard a lot of great things, and we'll circle back with Elise and work through this. And we look forward to meeting with you next time.
Great. And any other final comments before we sign off?
I would just like to thank the two members of the public that did speak up. That was very useful.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you guys for a lot of organized, really good comments and presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, same.
Great.
And not to be self-serving, I want to thank Elise for yeoman's work and taking this process over for the city.
Thanks, Elise.
It's really a pleasure to have some consultants to help.
You're doing a good job.
Thank you. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right. Good night.